Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Steele, and I'm a member of the Aspen Institute Board of Trustees, and on behalf of all of my fellow trustees and also the leadership of the Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the penultimate McCloskey 2014 Speaker Series of this summer. We have to begin by thanking Bonnie and Tom McCloskey and all of their family. We've had almost a decade of wonderful experiences sponsored by them, and it's just terrific. And there's one more later this next week, but it's been a great 10th year for them. You know, 2014 has been a wonderful summer for the Aspen Institute, and a lot of great and important things have happened here over the weeks of the summer, and we've been privileged to have lots of stimulating and importantly diverse highlights to report. We had the 10th anniversary of the Aspen Ideas Festival. We expanded the Aspen Ideas Festival to include a new aspect called Spotlight Health, which was incredibly successful for its inaugural edition. We also have had the 5th annual Aspen Security Forum, and also had the Aspen Action Forum, where 300 global fellows of the Institute came together here on campus to discuss all the best practices on how their contributions to their countries and communities can have a significant social impact. And they shared best practice among each other, and I can assure you all of us who got to drop in were impressed by their energy, enthusiasm, and ambition for the projects they've chosen. Tomorrow, as we move towards the end of the summer, we're quite excited to honor Doris Kearns Goodwin and Richard Goodwin and recognize them with the Aspen Institute Public Service Award. Beginning at 5 p.m. right here in Greenwald Pavilion, we'll host a stimulating conversation on presidential leadership, which will be led by Walter Isaacson with the Goodwins. So now let me turn to this evening. We're quite excited and honored to have on the stage 3 of the Institute's good friends in Secretary Albright, Gates, and Rice. Secretary Gates is just a few minutes out and will be joining us in what I'm sure will be an exciting entrance. You know, when you put 3 people of this level together, to be serious, I think all of us at the Institute are extremely honored and feel special that they've all been associated with the Institute in different ways. All 3 have been active members in the Aspen Strategy Group, and of course, Drs. Albright and Rice as trustees of your Institute's board. They all 3 exemplify what we think it means to practice values-based leadership, one of the key hallmarks of our Aspen Institute mission. So now let me introduce Nick Burns, who's going to lead the conversation, and Nick Burns will then introduce the secretaries, not that they need any introduction, and the plan will be to have a conversation for a short period of time, and I promise Secretary Gates is just a few minutes away, and then at the end of the conversation, Nick will organize and save some time for questions so that you can all engage with our 3 guests. So Nick Burns is moderating today, as I said, and he serves as the Sultan of Oman Professor of the Practice of the International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Nick has served our U.S. government for 27 years, which all of us have to say thank you for. He's been Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ambassador to Greece, and a State Department spokesperson. So everyone, please join me in welcoming these fine fellows and women to the stage.
Bob, thank you very much. The first thing I want to do is thank Bob Steele and thank Walter Isaacson for their leadership of the Aspen Institute. As Bob said, we're extraordinarily fortunate to have 2 great secretaries of state, Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice. The 3rd person is going to arrive. I spoke to him by phone just a couple of minutes ago. His plane was diverted. He's had to drive in. So I said we'd filibuster until he arrived. And one way to do that is just to say a word about our Aspen Strategy Group. We are a unique institution, I think, in the American foreign policy firmament because we are nonpartisan. We're not just bipartisan. We are Republicans, Democrats, and independents that come together once a year here in Aspen. We have dialogues with the Chinese, Indian, and Brazilian leaderships. We are in our 30th year. We were founded by 2 great Americans, General Brent Scowcroft, who unfortunately is not here right now but will be in a couple of hours, and Professor Joe Nye, Harvard University. And so I would ask you to salute Joe. Maybe, Joe, you could stand. And we're going to be discussing Russia over the next 3.5 days in an off-the-record conversation. There's nothing to talk about in U.S.-Russian relations these days, but everything to talk about. And I thought, as we await Bob's arrival, we might talk about the issue that united Condoleezza Rice and Madeleine Albright. And it was a shared interest in Russia, and it was one individual who brought them both to that shared interest. And maybe the way to do this, Condi, is for you to start and Madeleine to finish that story.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us here. And Nick, thank you for this conversation. And I just want to echo thanks to Walter and Bob, who year after year pull off really extraordinary conversations in a wonderful and civil way. I was, not to put too fine a point on it, a failed piano major in college. I was supposed to be a great pianist, started playing at the age of 3. I came here as a 17-year-old rising junior, as my kids now call it, at the University of Denver, to go to the Aspen Music Festival School. And I met here 12-year-olds who could play from sight what it had taken me all year to learn. And I thought, find another profession. And so I went back to Denver. I was taking classes, tried a lot of things, and fortunately wandered into a course in international politics taught by a Soviet specialist, a Czech emigre, a great diplomat, a man named Joseph Korbel. And it was Joseph Korbel that stimulated my interest in things international, my interest in things Russian, my interest in diplomatic history. And he convinced me that it was okay for a black girl from Birmingham, Alabama to want to be a Soviet specialist. And that was the start of my career. I just have to say, he also said, and I have a daughter that I'd like you to meet sometime. She's studying with Zbig Brzezinski at Columbia. Her name is Madeleine, and now you can take that story.
So, what happened was my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat who didn't want to work for the communists and came to the United States and defected. And at that stage, I understand now how it works, the Rockefeller Foundation found him a job at the University of Denver. We had no idea where Denver was. My parents bought a car and started driving across America. And my mother said, everybody says Denver's the mile-high city, but we're not going up, so maybe we're going the wrong direction. So anyway, my father started teaching at the University of Denver and ultimately became dean of the graduate school. And he died in 1977, and by then he was a really big deal, and there were lots of flowers and tributes and things at his funeral. And among them was this beautiful ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with some leaves and things in it. And I said to my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice. So in 1987, when I was working for my long string of losing Democratic presidential candidates, I thought, why not, in fact, get in touch with this woman, Condoleezza Rice, who was, I knew, an African-American music major from Alabama who wrote her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military with my father. So I thought, she teaches on the West Coast, Soviet expert, I'll ask her to join my group. Joe was a part of the group. And I said, Condi, this is what I'm doing. And she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father. So here we are.
Here we are.
Okay. And Bob hasn't arrived yet. Let's get started on Russia. So Condi and Madeleine, the question I would want to pose to you, maybe Condi first, is the following. At the end of the Sochi Olympics, perhaps as a target of opportunity when Yanukovych fled Kiev, President Putin decided essentially to invade and take over Crimea. The Russian Duma formally annexed it, and since then we've seen a rather deliberate campaign to support. Here he is.
Yeah.
How was the car ride?
Fortunately, the Colorado State Patrol was nowhere in sight.
We won't tell. So, Bob, we were filibustering until you made your very dramatic entrance. And I was just posing actually the first question. And what unites this panel is that Madeleine, since the beginning of her life in Czechoslovakia, has had to be concerned about Russia. Condi, PhD dissertation, Bob, career Soviet specialist in the Central Intelligence Agency. So they've all lived this issue. And we've seen...
So have you.
And I have as well. And so we've seen now the formal annexation of Crimea. We've seen a deliberate policy to destabilize eastern Ukraine through Russian military support, intelligence support for the separatists so that Ukraine's in the throes of a civil war. We have Russian troops massing today on the borders of that part of eastern Ukraine. And the question to the three of you, maybe Condi will start with you, is this the most acute, serious East-West crisis since the end of the Cold War? And here's the easy part, what should we do about it?
Well, yes, I think it is the most serious East-West crisis since the end of the Cold War, in large part because it's been a long time since a country, a big power in Europe, annexed part of its neighbor. And when great powers start behaving badly, it gets really dangerous. The Malaysian airplane that was shot down because of the sophistication of the equipment. 30,000 feet is a long way up to catch a civilian aircraft. And so when great powers start behaving badly, it gets really dangerous. And we have a great power in Europe behaving badly. Vladimir Putin never accepted the outcome of the end of the Cold War. He has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. That's something when you consider that the Russians lost probably as many as 30 million people in World War II. It's quite a statement to say that was the greatest tragedy. And then he said something that I think is particularly dangerous, and that is that the reason it was a great tragedy is that 25 million Russians were orphaned outside of the Soviet Union in other countries. He means Poland, Ukraine. I remember sitting with him at NATO in 2008 in his last talk to the NATO-Russia Council, and he said something that everybody sort of said, did we hear that right? He said, Ukraine is a made-up state, he said. And I can remember going to see Vladimir Putin, and in one of my last encounters with him, having him say, you know us, Condi. You know that Russia has only been great when it was ruled by strong men, like Alexander the Great, like Alexander II, like Peter the Great. And I remember thinking, and then is Vladimir the Great supposed to be in that line? But I was too polite to ask. I was Secretary of State. And so we have now, I think, a very dangerous perfect storm between a leader who is unreconciled to the post-war, post-Cold War order in Europe, willing to use a combination of economic pressure, military force, intimidation, and surrogates to get his way to try to undo that order, and an international community that seems at times uncertain how to respond. So let me leave it at the analysis of the question, and then perhaps we can get to ways to think about approaching it after Madeleine and Bob have spoken.
Madeleine.
I do think it is the most serious event since the end of the Cold War, and we all have been diplomats or in the government, and there are many people here with the same background. And there are things that happen all over the world all the time. There are changes, border disputes, various arguments that go on, and that's what people like us used to do for a living. But the bottom line is there have been two huge game changers in the last 6 months, and that is the Russian annexation of Crimea, as Condi said, and the other is what's happened in the Middle East. And in many ways, I think they are related to each other, and maybe we'll get into that. I think that I've been further away from when I met Putin. I didn't like him from the moment I met him, and he didn't like me either. the bottom line is that I think that he has developed his own version of history. And that is the troublesome part. I think, as Condi said, anybody who can say that the dissolution of the Soviet Union is the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is delusional. And I do think that he has lived his own version of history, and he keeps making it up as it goes along. And I think we depend on the fact that there is a rational actor on the other side of the table. And so I'm kind of worried about his own approach to issues, and it does lead to the question of how we deal with it, because I think what he has done is identify himself with a very this really sounds like psychobabble, problem that Russia has been having. You were there, one of the things that we were asked to do, so were you, Bob, is basically how to devolve the power of our major adversary at the end of the Cold War without doing it in the field of battle. And it's true, I happen to think they lost the Cold War rather than we won it, because the system didn't work. And so we, in the 90s, all of us in some form or another, were working to try to figure out how Russia could be brought into the system and could be a normal country, and we could operate in a functional international system. I went, and I was doing survey work at the time in '91, and I'll never forget this. I was in Russia with a focus group, and this man stood up and he said, I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower, and now we're Bangladesh with missiles. And that loss of identity is something that is a motivating factor in Russia, and what has happened is Putin has identified himself with that, Vladimir the Great. I really do think he has, which somewhat I think accounts for his popularity at the moment. And so I think we have to deal with what has been happening in Russia since the end of the Cold War, what the relationship is with the United States, the identity crisis, and a leader who has made up history.
Yeah. Bob.
I think that, first of all, I agree in terms of the magnitude of the crisis. I also agree that it has its roots in what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think in the early 90s, we did not fully appreciate the magnitude of the humiliation that the Russians felt with the collapse, not just of the Soviet Union, but of the centuries-old Russian Empire. And I think one of the reasons we face a serious crisis, and why it's the worst since the end of the Cold War, is that Putin is really trying to upend two aspects of that, 2 points of international order that people thought were settled. The one was that border changes could only be resolved through peaceful negotiations and the consent of the parties, and not the satisfaction of revanchist claims by force. The second was the freedom of sovereign states to choose which other countries with whom they wanted to ally politically, economically, and for security. Both of those Putin has essentially thrown aside. And so what the Europeans and we for a long time felt was a matter settled at the end of the Cold War is now very much back up on the table. I think Putin has two goals. I don't know that he's delusional. Maybe because we both came from the spy business, he and I had a very interesting relationship. We didn't like each other, but there was a certain interesting respect or suspicion, I'm not sure which. But we would speak very frankly to one another, and partly because I wasn't a diplomat, and neither was he. But I think he has, after two things, and one is what Condi alluded to or talked about, and that is this sense of historical mission to protect the Russians who were left behind after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the second is more traditional Russian behavior, and that is the creation or recreation of a band of states on the periphery of Russia that lean toward Moscow economically, politically, and for security. He doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union, I don't think. He doesn't want to be responsible for all those economic basket cases on the periphery. But he does want to recreate this buffer, if you will, that has been very much a part of Russian history for a long time. And frankly, I think he sees Ukraine as the linchpin of that. Kiev was where the Russian Empire was founded over 1,000 years ago. I think he does see it as a made-up state. And I think that he will never rest easy as long as he thinks that Ukraine might slide west and away from Russia and not a part of that buffer of states on the periphery of Russia.
So let's get to policy. What should the United States do? We're going to hear tomorrow from Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, who's really been at the center of this. But as I appreciate what President Obama has tried to do, and he's worked very hard on this, sanction Russia to drive up the costs of the behavior in Ukraine. He didn't have much help from the Europeans until just 2 weeks ago when the Europeans finally joined the United States and Canada in tough sanctions. First. Second, try to help the Ukrainian state, which is a basket case of its own economically, high levels of corruption, to unite, to raise its economic performance, and to try to pull together an effective military. And third, try to reinforce NATO so that the frontline states of NATO, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, are protected, and there's a deterrence there. Is that the right strategy? Should all that be reinforced, Condi?
I have no problem with the 3 pillars. I think they're the right 3 pillars. But I think you have to now do them in a way that is really committed and that is likely to have a really big effect. When it comes to sanctions, I'm of 2 minds about sanctions. I think some of the sanctions are going to start to have an effect. I mean, after all, 80% of Russian exports are in oil, gas, and minerals. They are frankly likely to run out of money before Europe runs out of energy. So anything that takes what is currently, according even to the Russians, an economy that is probably in retreat and puts more pressure on it, that's fine. But I don't think that we can expect that that's going to have a short-term, maybe even medium-term effect on Putin. By the way, in the long term, there is more we could do on the energy front. Go ahead and permit Keystone today. Go ahead and permit export terminals today. Because you have to show Russia that the future of energy is not going to be in Russia if they continue to behave this way. So yes, sanctions, let's call it economic pressure of some kind. The second element, by all means, the Ukrainians have, I think, demonstrated that they are more capable of fighting than I thought they were. Arm them. It is not provocative to help people defend themselves.
So you'd provide lethal assistance?
I would provide lethal assistance to them, not just non-lethal assistance, and I would provide further intelligence to them so that they can help themselves. Third, I would do more with the strengthening of NATO, and we don't know what's going to come out of the September summit. Perhaps more will come out of it. But let me just, for this purpose, position myself someplace between Madeleine and Bob on the question of Vladimir Putin. I'm not sure he's delusional. I am sure he's not wholly rational. Because leaders of great countries don't go around fighting tigers bare-chested. He's a megalomaniac. And you have to deal with the 5% chance that he might in fact be delusional. And he is making up his own version of history, and I don't see anybody around him who's telling him, you know, this is not, he's talking about Russia becoming self-sufficient and autarkic again. How long has it been since we've heard those words? Joseph Stalin. So I would say let's, you know, you have to prepare for the 5% of him that may not be totally rational. And that means that when you reinforce NATO, you do it in a really serious way. We don't really need forces in Italy. Let's put them in the Baltic states. Let's put them in Poland in large enough numbers to matter. because he may indeed be a megalomaniac, but he's not going to attack a country in which you have American forces deployed. So I would just make a much bigger move to make NATO a real bulwark against him, just in case he has some notions that he might do some of the things he's doing in Ukraine in the Baltic states, to which we have an Article 5 guarantee. You do not want the President of the United States to have to make a choice between refusing to act on our Article 5 guarantee or fighting Russia, and so deter it now.
Thank you. Madeleine?
Well, I think all of us here require a little humility in terms of our Soviet expertise. And I just want to tell a story. In October 1964, I was a student of Zbigniew Brzezinski's at Columbia at the Russian Institute, where nobody predicted Khrushchev's ouster. And nobody predicted the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And so I think trying to predict Putin's behavior is pretty difficult. I don't know, I'm not a shrink, so maybe he just lives in a parallel universe or whatever the right term is. But I do think one of the problems that's out there that has to be a part of a solution is whether Putin can only think in zero-sum terms. Because these countries are where they are. And as Bob said, Ukraine does have a very complicated history, and geographically, it is a buffer. There's just no question about it. But what I think could be done is to try to figure out some way where the Ukrainians have the possibility of turning westward, which is what they want. The Ukrainians want to be Poles. They want to have the kind of life that now exists in Poland. And they also, I think, believe that they could have some kind of a rational economic relationship with Russia. The question is whether Putin only sees things in zero-sum terms. I think one of the things, I teach a course, I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. So what are the tools? There are not a lot of tools in the national security toolbox. And I think that President Obama is using the tools in the best possible way of finding an apt sanctions regime, finally in cooperation with the Europeans, and it is going to hurt. And I've said all along that Putin's victory in Crimea is a Pyrrhic victory, and a lot of it for the same reasons in terms of their economic situation. I do think that the Ukrainians need more assistance. And I think the question is, and I can't answer this, but I was in Ukraine for the elections. I was there as an observer, and I met with President Poroshenko, and he said that his real agenda was to do security and the economy. And the question is, if all they do is fight in the East, whether they forget about the fact that their country is basically an economic basket case, and in order to really survive in their neighborhood, they have to get their act together economically. So I think we need to give more assistance to Ukraine. I think we have to figure out a way. I certainly agree on the intelligence. I personally would probably give them some lethal weapons, and I definitely would strengthen NATO. Because NATO has turned out to be the best and most important political military alliance. And those other countries that do have Russian speakers, Latvia, big example, the Baltics, they are under NATO. They do have Article 5 rights, privileges. And so I do think I would strengthen NATO.
Could I just add just one thing, Bob, if you I want to just get on the table, too. We have to try and hold in place relations with Russians for whom Putin is not the future, too. We have had 20 years of since the collapse of the Soviet Union, where a whole generation of younger middle-class Russians, some of them are in my classes at the Graduate School of Business. You've taught them, you've worked with them. They work in Western banks, they work in Western law firms, and they are in a terrible state. I've had a couple of emails from these students who say, I'm about to apply for American citizenship. It's possible Russia will experience a brain drain, but I would hope, and it's really hard to do, that we could find a way to isolate Putin, Putinism, and the Putin regime without completely turning our backs on Russia's future.
I would just distance myself from the two secretaries of state in this respect. I always liked the definition of diplomacy as saying nice doggy until you could find a rock. I think Putin The thing to remember is that Putin could remain president of Russia until 2024. He's playing a long game, and I think we need a long game. And I agree with everything in terms of reaction, the short term, that Condi and Madeleine have described. I would provide lethal weapons, but with a heavy emphasis on those that are largely seen as defensive rather than an offensive capability. Sometimes that's a pretty thin line, but I think the long game, I remember in 2008, Condi and I realizing how much intelligence we were getting on how extensive Russian black ops were in Central Asia and places like Kyrgyzstan and so on, trying to stir up anti-Americanism. So this is not something that just started 6 months or a year ago. And I think what we need to do is not only strengthen NATO's military presence. My biggest worry for the Baltic states is not that Putin will send troops across. It is that he has such extraordinary economic leverage in all three of those places. And so one of the things that I think we ought to be looking at, both with respect to the Baltic states and with Ukraine, is what can we do to create a better safety net economically under those states, so that if Putin does start to turn the screws, using Russia's leverage in the Baltic states, economic leverage, but also the cyber capabilities that he demonstrated against Estonia, I think in 2007, that those Baltic states don't have to knuckle under because they've got an economic alternative. I think our focus in Ukraine ought not just be the short-term security, but we need to focus. I mean, let's face it, that country's government's been a basket case pretty much since independence. So focus on reform, on supporting reform in Ukraine, but also how can we help them economically? And then I think we need a more coherent pro-American, pro-Western agenda and activities all along the periphery of Russia. I wouldn't cede those states to Putin. I think we can make a strong case, and we did fight back in Kyrgyzstan because we needed Manas Air Base so much. We fought back against what the Russians were trying to do there. But I think in addition to the short-term sort of military deployments and so on, we need to be thinking of the long game. How do you prevent this buffer from being created? And by taking these actions economically and in security terms, how do we try and push Putin or others in Russia toward adjusting this zero-sum game attitude?
I'm going to ask the three secretaries about the news of the last 24 hours in Iraq. I also want to talk about American leadership, then we'll get to your questions, but there's a final question on Russia that we've talked about among ourselves, we've got to discuss. Our good friend and colleague, member of the Aspen Strategy Group, Richard Haass, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post this morning, and I think he made the very important point that we haven't talked about yet. I think all of us would agree on it. We need a relationship with Putin and Russia. As we sanction, isolate, and push back, we need the Russians to prevent the Iranians from becoming a nuclear weapons power. We need the Russians to stabilize the Afghan government, to contain North Korea, and to fight terrorist groups, because we're both victims of certain terrorist groups. So how do you keep that relationship with President Putin? Richard suggested, in print, on the record this morning, he said, perhaps what the United States and the West should do is to essentially say to the Russians, we, the West, will not support Ukraine and Georgia for NATO membership. And then in return, President Putin will have to respect the sovereignty and control of the Ukrainian government and eastern Ukraine. Is that a bet? Is that an agreement that we should make, or is it not, Madeleine?
Well, first of all, I think that the countries in question should be the ones to make a choice as to whether they want to be a member of an alliance or not, or what their future is. As somebody who was born in Czechoslovakia, during Munich, the Czechoslovaks were not at the table, and therefore nothing can be done without the Ukrainians being a part of the decision-making process. NATO is not a charitable organization. It is a functioning military alliance, and countries have to be ready to be part of it, and countries have to request to be a part of it. They have kind of indicated that they're not working in that direction at this moment. I do think it's important for us to maintain a relationship with the Russians, but not at the cost of where we make them think they are more important than they are, which may have something to do with what's happened in Syria. So I think that there needs to be, the channels need to be maintained. I think there are relationships that have to stay in place, and we can't be a zero sum in terms of thinking that there's only one way to do things. I do think that it's up to Ukraine to make the choice.
I agree completely. Countries should be able to make their own choice. We, several times in history, have done this thing where we negotiated over the heads of small countries. It hasn't ever worked out so well. I think that there's an assumption that this is what Putin wants. He wants a relationship with us right now. He may want other things, and we have to take that into account. But we also have to remember that when the Russians act, if they act on North Korea, or they act against terrorism, or even with Iran, they have certain interests as well that may in fact be coincident, if not identical, to ours. And we can continue to work on those issues where we have coincident interests. I always felt in the period between 2006, where you, Nick, had helped to set up the P5+1 for Iran, it got to a place that actually the Russians were not the problem in dealing with Iran. The Chinese were the problem in dealing with Iran. And that's because the Russians have had their own problems with Iran in the south of Russia, stirring up trouble among the ethnically Islamic states. And so, again, not to make them seem so important, to recognize that they have their own interest, and very often our interests will come together. But it is beneath us and as a moral issue, and it simply also doesn't work to negotiate over the heads of small states.
I agree with what both Madeleine and Condi said.
Okay. Kansas brevity. So 2 more questions. I think all of us would agree we're facing a burning Middle East, from a crippled Egypt right now economically, with a big major sectarian fissure in society, sectarian religious fissure. Syria, 22 million people, 9 million homeless, as David Miliband, a member of this group, would tell you. ISIS controlling northern Syria and western Iraq. ISIS having taken the second biggest city in Iraq, Mosul, now 30 kilometers west of Erbil. The Peshmerga having been defeated tactically, the Kurdish forces in 2 battles over the last few days. The administration has airdropped relief to some of the tens of thousands of refugees created this week up in Mount Sinjar. The administration has launched, according to the press, at least 3 airstrikes against ISIS positions in the last 24 hours. What would you advise President Obama? This is an extraordinarily difficult problem. Will it take a reimposition, in a way, of American air power over weeks or months to contain and to push back ISIS so that Iraq has a chance of remaining a unitary state? Maybe, Bob, since this goes right up your alley, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, I would say that we need to keep in mind that there are multiple huge historical conflicts going on in the Middle East simultaneously. You've got Shia Islam led by Iran versus Sunni Islam led by Saudi Arabia. You've got secularists versus Islamists. You've got reformers versus authoritarians. And you have this struggle to see whether artificially stuck together states like Syria, Iraq, and Libya, comprised of historically adversarial ethnic and religious groups, can be held together without repression. So all that's going on. And my own view is that we overestimate our ability to shape events in the Middle East. So Madeleine talked about humility when it came to the Soviet Union and what was going on there. I think a lot of humility is required in the Middle East at this point as well. Now, that said, my view is that the president has done the right thing in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to Yazidis and also trying to stop those columns of ISIL forces that would like to slaughter all of these people. I think that our efforts to help the Iraqis. First of all, I think the outcome, I hope this weekend, of the power struggle in Iraq in terms of who ought to lead the country gets resolved without Maliki coming out still in his job. I think he has been a very destructive force in Iraq, particularly since we left. And I think that somebody who can reach out to the Sunnis and give them a sense of that they have a stake in a unified Iraq is absolutely essential. And particularly if that change is made. So my caveat is, if Maliki stays in office, I'm not sure I would recommend what I would otherwise recommend, which is, I think we ought to be much more aggressive in helping the Iraqis and helping the Kurds take on these guys. We should not let them take control of the Mosul Dam. We should not let them have a stranglehold on water and electrical supplies for a good part of the country. I think intelligence, I think a variety of kinds of military assistance could be made available. And I think we're already doing the intelligence. I think that there is an aversion, obviously, in America to the introduction of any kind of ground troops. My own view is that once we start targeting ISIL, they will start mingling with or using civilians to raise the public costs of any kind of Western intervention. But I still think we need to make that effort. And in terms of Syria, Syria is a much more challenging problem now than it would have been 3 years ago or so. But the challenge in Syria, it seems to me, is there a path through which you can weaken both Assad and ISIL? And my guess is that's more, first of all, it needs to be done in cooperation with with some of the neighboring states in the Middle East. I also think it's more the work of intelligence operatives than perhaps overt military. But I think our objective would be to see if there is a seam there, particularly in Syria, where we could weaken both Assad, if we were to identify an alternative where conventional military force could accomplish both of those objectives, then I, for one, would be willing to think that ought to be on the table.
Well, I agree with everything Bob has said. I think Maliki is a big problem. I would be most happy if he could go tomorrow. I would have been happy if he'd been gone 6 months ago. But I think whether he is there or not, we have a serious security problem when ISIS, which is a group so bad that Al-Qaeda expelled them for radicalism, has taken a swath of territory between Syria and Iraq, and you might have noted also moved toward Lebanon recently, engaging the Lebanese armed forces. By all accounts, they are organized, they are capable, but there are 10,000 of them at this point. One of the dangers, the president has said many times that he wants to know that there's a threat to the United States and our interests. We watched what happened when bin Laden was able to use the territory of Afghanistan to burrow in, to train, to get stronger with Al-Qaeda. And the suicide hijackers, not a single of them, one of them was on an American or European passport. Now, these fighters have among them probably 100 American passport holders, maybe as many as 1,000 European passport holders. That's a homeland nightmare as well. And so I think we have got to do something to help the Iraqi forces, and particularly the Kurds, for whom we have a long history of cooperation, to do something about this really, really dangerous circumstance in the middle of the Middle East. I agree with Bob. One wonders whether the Middle East state system, under the twin pressures now of the kind of breakup of these states, and the pressure still for popular revolutions and popular control, whether or not the Middle East is just going to go through a major convulsion anyway. But if it's going to go through a major convulsion, one piece that we cannot allow to remain standing is a jihadist group of that capability with that much in the way of resources in the middle of the Middle East, capable of attacks across Europe and the United States.
I do think we have to worry about the threat to the homeland. There's no question about that, and the way Condi describes the facts are absolutely accurate in terms of the numbers of people there that have American passports, so that is a concern. I think the thing that is also a concern, and is something that has led the president to change in terms of the airstrikes, has to do with the humanitarian situation. And one of the things that has troubled me all along is that we haven't cared enough about the humanitarian situation in Syria, and not only the specific things about the number of people who've died or the number of people who've been displaced, but the effect of having all those displaced people, whether they are in Jordan, which in itself is a very fragile place, or in Lebanon or in Turkey, the combination of the humanitarian aspect and the political displacement is something that we need to worry about. I think there really is the question as to whether the U.S. can do anything about what is a major convulsion in the Middle East. I always happen to believe that the U.S. does have a role. I do believe we're the indispensable nation. But there is nothing in the term indispensable that says alone, that this is a problem for the international community, and it is political as well as military, and the humanitarian part is definitely something that is an international responsibility. What I find interesting is the blending over this weekend or this week of the political and military. One of the questions, as I understand it from reading the newspapers, is that in fact there was a question as to whether there was a reluctance to use force to be Maliki's Air Force. What the humanitarian part of this now has changed that analysis or that equilibrium, and Maliki may in fact be out. But the bottom line is, I think that what the president has done in the last 24 hours is exactly the right thing and may in fact affect the political situation as well as the military one.
Thanks to all of you. One last question. It's about American leadership, and it's about the willingness of the American people and Congress to support an energetic American foreign policy. The public opinion polls show that the American people, after the Great Recession, after Iraq and Afghanistan, don't want to see American military troops committed to big long-term ventures. Congress is having a hard time supporting the State Department budget. We have a huge number of American ambassadors who've been waiting for 6 months or more to be confirmed. And I think when the 51 African heads of state came to the White House this week, in a majority of those countries, we don't have ambassadors because of political paralysis in Washington. Are we turning inward? It's too simplistic to say that we're facing a new isolationism of the type that we faced in the 20s and 30s. But are we turning inward in a way that would limit our ability to play the role we have to play in the world?
Well, I am concerned about that. I do think that I hate to see Washington dysfunctional. I hate to see the fact that it's time to blame the press, is that the stories about what is going on have not been explained enough to the American people to understand what our real effect is when we're not involved. I can understand why, given the problems that exist in the U.S., we think we have no effect on this, but I think that there really is a question at the moment about the United States turning inward, and I do know, if you look at history, the times that America has turned inward, terrible things have happened in the world. And so I do hope that our leaders try to explain why we need to be a part of things and why there has to be partnership. I believe President Obama believes in partnership. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But all it basically means is partnership. But the bottom line is there have to be partners out there that are also persuaded that we can change the dynamic, whether it's in the Middle East or with Russia. But we cannot let our people decide that America can be an island.
I completely agree. I would say that I am all for partnerships, all for them. But partnerships have usually in international history, at least since the end of World War II, come about when America stakes a position and finds partners for it. I mean, the international community doesn't function very well as a community in which one gets together and everybody decides what to do. And I think that the situation that we're in now, Europe more than ever looks that it's turned inward for a variety of reasons having to do with its own problems. We've always hoped that the new emerging strong democracies, places like India and Brazil, would step up to international responsibilities. They really haven't. They've demurred. And the United States is left again to try to define a pathway forward out of this extremely difficult circumstance in which we find ourselves. And our subject matter today is Europe and Russia, the Middle East, but we know that there are problems in Asia as well, where China is asserting certain responsibilities and certain territorial claims that are also a challenge to our allies. So the United States, and I understand being tired. Believe me, I understand being tired. I've told the story in August of 2008. I was in the Oval Office with President Bush, and the polls were really awful, and he said, I don't believe we're this unpopular. And I said, you know, Mr. President, actually, the American people are tired of us. I said, you know, it's been war, it's been vigilance, it's been terrorism, they're tired of us. I said, and I'm tired of them too. It's time for us to go home. Because at that point, everybody was tired. But great powers, as a matter of fact, the great power can't afford to be tired. Vladimir Putin isn't tired. China isn't tired. ISIS isn't tired. And so the United States is going to have to find a way not to be tired. And I have only one suggestion. I have only one suggestion in how to signal that. And it's actually just a pretty basic thing. Washington is indeed pretty dysfunctional. That means you're not likely to get budgets for a while. And so signaling that the defense cuts that had been contemplated by Secretary Hagel, that those defense cuts are just being reconsidered, might send a signal to our allies and to our foes that America is really in the game. Because I do think we've sent signals that we are tired. We've sent signals that we won't ever use military force. We've sent signals that we want somebody else to step up to the plate. And I'm encouraged the fact this weekend by President Obama's decision for humanitarian support, and I hope support to the Iraqis. But we need to do much, much more of that if we're going to turn the tide, because when The Economist is asking, what will America fight for? We've got a problem.
I would say, in terms of perceptions of us abroad, extricating oneself from conflicts, and particularly two wars or any war that did not end in a clear-cut victory, is a very tricky business. And the truth is, Nixon and Kissinger were able significantly to mitigate the consequences of our losing in Vietnam by the openings to the Soviet Union and China, that in effect reasserted that the United States was still going to be the primary player in the international environment, that we were still going to be calling the shots. We don't have opportunities like that right now. And the more we talk about coming home, about nation building at home, and the more we cut the State Department budget and the defense, the more we cut the budgets of all of the instruments of foreign power and influence that we have, the more we send the signal that we are turning inward. So I think that this was going to be tough under any circumstances, not to send the signal that we were pulling back. But I think some of the things that Condi has suggested, some of the things Madeleine has suggested, a more aggressive leadership role in putting together some of these partnerships, particularly in the Middle East, I think is in order. When it comes to the American people, I think it's important to remember that virtually none of our wars have ever really been popular. World War II was pretty popular until the middle of 1944, when people started getting pretty tired. But the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, Korea, Vietnam, American people don't like wars. And the truth is, the best advice that I've seen in terms of war in this country was given by the most important general probably nobody's ever heard of, a two-star named Fox Connor, whose proteges were George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower. And Fox Connor had 3 axioms in talking about war. Never go to war unless you have to. Never fight alone. And never fight for long. Not bad. And so the way we have overcome this in the past, Americans, I think, generally aren't very interested in what goes on in the rest of the world. Foreign aid has always been about as popular as something terrible. And so it has always fallen to our leadership to persuade and to educate the American people why these things are necessary, why these tools are necessary, why our engagement is necessary. People forget that in the summer of 1941, selective service was continued by 1 vote. So what is missing, it seems to me, is the kind of persuasive leadership, not just from the president, but from the leaders of both parties, and particularly in Congress, that our leadership is still needed in the world, and that without that leadership, we are going to face far worse circumstances one day in the future. But it's that leadership that has always made the difference for us.
Thanks to Bob and Condi and Madeleine. We haven't talked about China. We've not talked about Africa. Glancing reference to India and Brazil. A lot out there for people to ask about. We've got about 20 minutes for your questions. You'll have microphones in both aisles. Please step forward into the aisle. My only request, just let us know your name. Make sure that what you say ends in a question mark, which is a very important part of this exercise.
Not a hearing.
It's not a hearing.
Thank you. I'm Judy Allen from Houston, Texas, and Aspen. I've just come out of the 3-day symposium of the Aspen Institute on the Ukraine. So I know just enough to be dangerous. There was much discussion in our seminar, or symposia, on the 1994 Memorandum of Understanding between the United States, the Ukraine, and Russia that allowed the Ukraine to give up their nuclear forces. They were the 3rd largest nuclear power in the world at that time, so we were told. The United States signed it, Russia signed it, the Ukraine signed it. Do we not have a moral obligation to defend the Ukraine because we promised in that memorandum that if they gave up their nukes, we the three, Russia and the U.S., would support the Ukraine economically if there was aggression against them and militarily?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. I'd like to just state a couple of facts and then ask Madeleine to address it. Strobe Talbot, who's seated here in the front row, Graham Allison, who's undoubtedly here, and I were with President Clinton in Budapest on December 7th, 1994. The Clinton administration believed that the presence of nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine was fundamentally destabilizing. We worked with those governments to convince them to give up their nuclear weapons. They were returned to the Russian Federation, and I still think that was a very good deal for the United States. It's been supported by President Bush and President Obama. We gave the Ukrainians, in a document that is now public, you can read it online, security assurances. We said very clearly to them, if your sovereignty is threatened, your territory, we will try to help you, but we did not give them what in diplomatic parlance is called security guarantees. We didn't say, we're giving you a security guarantee that we will be there with military force to protect you. And President Kravchuk of Ukraine clearly understood that. Madeleine.
That is the record, and I think part of the thing, there's misunderstanding. It was a memorandum of understanding. It was not a treaty. And actually, it's the Russians who broke the memorandum of understanding. But I think people understood what it was about at the time.
Thank you very much. Over here, a question? No questions over there? Yes.
Yes,
Oh, there is.
Yes.
Please.
I'm Charlotte Buchanan. I'd like to know why it was all right for the United States to recognize the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, and elected Yanukovych as president, and within a few days acknowledging as legitimate the self-proclaimed leaders as the legitimate leaders, at the same time that we said in Ukraine, which had, of course, been part of Russia until Khrushchev gave it back, not gave it back, but gave it to the Ukraine in 1950s, that they had a government and a referendum that was closer to democracy, which we support. Why was one okay and not the other?
Well, let me just start, and maybe Madeleine would like to, because she was recently there for the elections. Yanukovych lost the confidence of his people. That's what the scenes in Kyiv were about. And we were very careful to say that we needed to have elections then for a properly elected president of Ukraine, who the United States would then recognize as the legitimate leader of Ukraine, and Madeleine was there for those elections. So that's that side of the equation. When it comes to Crimea, it is true that Crimea was given to Ukraine in 1954 when Nikita Khrushchev, recognizing, by the way, that since it was all the Soviet Union, it didn't matter, in a gesture of friendship gave Crimea to Ukraine. But whatever the circumstances, when borders are fixed internationally, it is generally the belief of the international system that those borders are then fixed. And a referendum that took place under questionable circumstances in Crimea under the threat of Russian power, I think doesn't stand the test of a democratic referendum for the future of Crimea. And so that would be my answer to why they are indeed different.
I think that the pictures and everything out of Kiev and Ukraine were very clear about the will of the people. And one of the things that you left out is Yanukovych disappeared. He basically abandoned his country, and there was a real question as to what government could come into existence. And I believe that it was a government that was came out of the parliament and chosen in a way, the best possible way at that particular time. So I was in Kiev just a month ago. Maidan was still something, the square there, which really is in memory of all the people that were there for months, calling for elections and freedom and a government that responded to their wishes. I think the Crimean issue is very complicated. All of us have been steeped in the history of Ukraine, Crimea, Russia, and clearly Crimea has played a huge role in Russian history. I happen to believe that had there been a completely free and fair referendum without any use of force, that it might have been possible for Crimea to join Russia. There have been many examples of countries, pieces of countries being moved over or being part of a new country in a democratic and careful legal way. The thing that was so outrageous was the penetration of Crimea by the little green people that were basically stooges of the Russian army. And so it was something that had not been done in the 21st century, is seizing land illegally. And it then tainted everything that was done in terms of Yanukovych's behavior and the democratic aspect to this.
Bob, if I could just ask you, this is a very important question. The Ukrainian nation has been divided. There's a significant minority in the eastern part of the country, ethnically Russian, that doesn't feel comfortable with the Ukrainian government in Kiev, that does want some, at least cultural ties with Russia, that wants local autonomy, that wants Russian language in the schools. Isn't that a factor the United States should be aware of and take into account in our policy?
I think so, and I think that one of the things that the new Ukrainian government and leadership has talked about is, in a democratic process, in the context of a unitary Ukraine, of having a debate about what kind of autonomy or greater autonomy different regions, and the eastern region in particular, might have in terms of assuring the rights of the Russians, their language, their religion, and so on and so forth. But I think it has to take place within the framework. You know, it's like we used to talk about Iraq. We can talk about autonomy. When I would go up to Erbil and talk to Barzani and company, it has to be in the context of we will support you, and you need to have autonomy, but it's within the framework of a unified Iraq. That ought to be our attitude, it seems to me, in dealing with Ukraine at this point. Autonomy, greater autonomy, ought to be on the table, but it ought to be on the table as a Ukrainian internal issue.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Mr. Secretary, Madam Secretary, Ambassador Burns, quite a group up there. Thank you very much for your comments. My name is Fletcher Newton. I am in the nuclear energy business and do all of my work in the former Soviet Union. The question of sanctions, do we run the risk of somehow painting the Russians into a corner, particularly given the fact that sanctions at this point really haven't done much? What's been most damaging to the Russians, I think, is the immediate reaction of the credit markets. The Russians are now absolutely unable to sell any more uranium in the United States, not because of sanctions, but because fuel managers simply won't buy Russian fuel because of what's happened. So my question is, are these sanctions something that we should use, or should we instead abandon that approach and, to your point, Mr. Secretary, focus more on the kinds of political leadership, and I would say actually engagement in Russia, because that in fact is what provides for the most significant penalties that they will pay when they behave as they're behaving now?
I think that the trick here is figuring out what the right balance is in terms of trying to increase both the internal and external pressures on Putin to change. And I want to go back to something Condi said about, let's not forget there are other Russians out there. And Condi and I met a couple of times, and she more often than I did with Dmitry Medvedev. And I came away from my sessions with Medvedev thinking, this guy gets it. He understands why Russia's in trouble, why Russia needs foreign investment, why Russia needs a greater rule of law, why it needs to be more democratic, and why it needs to move more toward the West. And I think it's one of the great tragedies of Russia, which seemed to happen with great regularity in Russia, that all of that potential was essentially wiped away by Putin's desire to resume the presidency. So sanctions are, in some ways, can be very narrowly focused, and in others have very broad effect. The narrow focus, I think, has been in going after specific individuals around Putin and those that we think have been involved in these activities in Ukraine, the security services and so on. I think the tough issue, and first of all, I agree with the sanctions that have been placed on Russia at this point, but the key is, and it goes again back to Condi's comment, it goes back to how do you bring pressure on Putin without breaking Russia? A dysfunctional Russia, or a Russia that faces grave internal problems for a long time to come, is not in the interests of the international community or the United States. So far, I think they've got the balance about right, but it's something that I think you have to keep your eye on. But you have to bring both internal and external pressure to bear.
I think that's the right answer.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. The first is going to be from Giulio Tremonti, who is president of Aspen, Italia, and a former senior government official in the Italian government.
So, a very European demand. What about Germany? What about Germany in the absence of Europe? What about the relationship increasing in divenire between Germany, Russia, and China? So, the old scheme was the Atlantic one. The new scheme could be continental. So do you fear a new version, a new edition of the old terrible book written by Carl Schmitt?
Well, I have a great deal of confidence in the unified democratic Germany. In fact, I have a lot of confidence in Chancellor Merkel's leadership, which I think has been pretty extraordinary given all that Germany has faced since the financial crisis, and really to keep both the euro and the European Union from unraveling at times when it looked like the Greek crisis and then follow-on crises might in fact do that. So I'm actually pretty confident. It's not that we don't have strains and tensions with Germany. We do. Even the United States has strains and tensions with Germany. And it's clear that it's not the kind of Atlantic feel that we had with Helmut Kohl. And those who remembered World War II remembered the way that the United States defended a democratic Germany. But things change with generations. What I don't think has changed is the sort of rock-solid shared values with the unified Germany, and I'm confident about that. Germany's role of always bridging to Russia has always been something that people worry about in the Atlantic relationship. But if you look what's happening in the last months at least, if there was a chance that Germany was going to try to move closer to Russia, Vladimir Putin has made sure that that's not going to happen. Angela Merkel is herself an Easterner. I watched her in NATO engagements with the East Europeans. She had a natural affinity for them. Even though Germany did not support membership action plan for Ukraine or for Georgia, she knew how to talk to the East Europeans about their inclusion in NATO. And so I'm not actually concerned about a German-Russian axis. And let me just say one word about a Russia-China axis as well, because that's out there too. You know, the big 30-year gas deal that they've been trying to make for all of this time, they finally get it right. There's something kind of interesting in that one day it wasn't done, and then the next day it was. And one wonders if that wasn't essentially a political deal, the details to be worked out later. Did Gazprom actually get an international price from China or not? Nobody seems to know. And I think that the possibilities for a China-Russia axis can also be overestimated. Most importantly, because China has extremely hard work to do. They're going to try to make 363 reforms that are not just economic reforms, they're big social reforms, like a social safety net and the like. The road for China to successful reform does not go through Moscow. It goes through the international economy in which the United States and Europe are still dominant. And so while you may have some of that relationship between Russia and China, I'm not worried that it becomes a long-term strategic relationship. The piece that I am a little worried about is what people are now calling the call to illiberal democratic leadership. And Vladimir Putin does represent, for people like Xi Jinping, and we recently see for Orban in Hungary, a so-called alternative to Western democracy. And that's something that bears watching. But just on pure interest terms, I see neither Germany moving toward Russia nor Russia and China in a long-term strategic relationship.
Let me tell a quick anecdote about Russia and China. So I'm in this, I'm giving a talk to the Russian General Staff Academy in Moscow as secretary. And a colonel stands up in the back and says, why are the United States and China plotting to take over Siberia? And And I must say, I don't get stumped too often, but I couldn't figure out where the hell that came from. So I gave some kind of anodyne comment that we weren't interested in Siberia. And then I asked Bill Burns, our ambassador, I said, where in the world did that come from? And he said, well, a couple of months ago, Madeleine gave a speech in which she said, how can Russia possibly exploit Siberia with the depopulation of the country? That's essentially all she said, but it is a measure of the paranoia about both China and the United States that exists in Moscow.
Not to speak paranoia about Madeleine.
Defend yourself.
Yeah, but, well, I mean, partially my problem is that I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and we do believe in Western values, and basically, which is a good way to answer the question, and I think that we sometimes forget about the importance of Western values and what has linked the United States and Europe and other countries for a very long time. And I believe that it is a good time to kind of reaffirm our vows. I look at Javier Solana, who was Secretary General of NATO and the European Minister, and the amount of work that we did together at the time. There is going to be a NATO meeting in September. I think that some of our discussion here today makes very clear the importance of that relationship. I was born in Europe, and so I often say to any European, I'm just like you, I just happen to have been raised in the United States. I think Europe needs to pull up its socks. I can say that as a European, and I really do think that that reaffirmation of the values, of Western values that have united us, some of them humanitarian, and Condi and I have talked about democracy a lot. I think we need to understand who we are, what role the United States and our allies can play in what the most famous recent statement I have made, which is that the world is a mess, and they need us and a reaffirmation of Western values.
We have time for one more question right here. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Michael Hannon. I'm curious about, clearly we've all agreed trying to get inside President Putin's head is dangerous business, but last September 11th, the New York Times op-ed that President Putin released about Syria, reading that today is very confusing and a little terrifying given everything that's happened between now and then. What do you think President Putin was after in that?
You can start that. Bob is the one who had a certain professional camaraderie with him, so we'll let him start.
Well, in all honesty, I don't remember the op-ed, but I will tell you what I think Putin is up to in Syria. Syria is really the last, the Russian Navy base at Latakia is about the last Russian Navy base outside of Russia's borders. That remains from the before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Saddam Hussein was one of the Soviet Union's primary clients. Syria has been a primary client for decades. My view is that Putin is determined to retain Syria as a partner in the Middle East, as a place where Russia has a presence, and because of its presence and its influence there, therefore a role in anything that happens diplomatically in the region. I think they see their presence and their support for Assad as being their entry fee into anything that happens in the region, whether it has to do with security or anything else. And I will tell you my own personal opinion is that I think that he was, whether he's delusional or not, his move on the chemical weapons was tactically extremely clever, because with the anticipation of being able to get the chemical weapons out of Syria, the U.S. policy there went in space of a week from Assad must go to implicitly Assad must stay in order to fulfill the commitment on the chemical weapons. And so, in my view, we got distracted by a horrible atrocity involving 1,400 people, and it led us to neglect the fact that 150,000 have been killed by conventional weapons. But I think Putin's initiative was clever tactically. It helped assure Assad more time in office. But I think Syria, I think he sees that as his marker in the Middle East.
And I think that if you look at Syria kind of in the context of what he was saying there, you know, there's a lot about how others shouldn't consider themselves exceptional and so forth and so on, which obviously was a direct attack on American exceptionalism. But I think that what you really see is that Vladimir Putin has decided, perhaps for reasons of reestablishing identity, which Russia really didn't kind of know what its identity was after the Soviet Union collapsed. We have to remember that the Soviet Union was a rough approximation of the Russian Empire plus. And so Russia hasn't really existed without reference to empire for a very, very long time. And when the Soviet Union broke up, they lost Ukraine, they lost Central Asia. What was Russia? What was Russia's future? Really got called into question. And the great thing about the Soviet Union, if you were a Russian nationalist, even if you didn't particularly think it functioned very well, was it had both an identity and it had respect and power in the international system. Great powers don't mind their own business. Great powers want to shape the international environment. And the Soviet Union had a view of how international history ought to unfold toward communism, toward state control of the economy, and they imposed that on a lot of unwitting countries, particularly in Eastern Europe. Then all of that collapses. Now Vladimir Putin is coming back, and I think Syria, Ukraine, they are all a part of a piece, which is to reestablish a Russian identity that is rooted in a great power identity and that has a view. There is an interesting tome that was written by somebody for whom I have a lot of respect, or had a lot of respect, Sergei Ivanov, who was the Russian defense minister at one point, somebody that I've dealt with who I felt was one of my best interlocutors in the Russian government. But it is a long piece about how Russia is neither Western nor Eastern. Russia is unique. It says that Russia should not give way to Western values like tolerance and multiculturalism, which weaken Russia. This is recreating a view of what Russia is, what Russian identity is, and how it relates to Russia's great power role.
And that's the third
this is Russia, the third version, yeah. And that's why I thought he wrote the op-ed that he did. It was a kind of manifesto for a Russian future that he feels they've lost. Just to close, a good friend of mine who's a Russian once said to me, you know, you Americans, with your color revolutions and your support for democracy and your national endowment for democracy, you won't be satisfied until Russia is back at the borders of the Duchy of Muscovy. Think about that, because it means that for those particular people, Russian empire, Russian expansion, and Russian identity are somehow linked.
I think that Putin is very good at tactics and not necessarily at long-term strategy because of the way that we've all now described their sense of history. What I find interesting, and to repeat, we all in some form or another have spent an awful lot of time studying Russian history and the Soviet Union, and there has been forever this discussion between Slavophiles and Westernizers and how does Russia and the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, fit in. It is a national obsession. And I think that it does go to the question of identity. I've been fascinated by some of the speeches and writings that Putin has had in which he is trying to get his head around what Russia's role is these days. What I find so troubling and difficult in terms of policy is that Strobe and I, President Clinton, operated on the basis of the fact that we thought Russia would be respected if it were part of an international system. that would come with the respect and identity, and that they would feel that they were part of something larger than themselves, and that it wasn't something that was attacking them, but we were trying to figure out how to welcome them into a post-Cold War world community. And so in the long run, I think Putin may be good at the tactics on Syria chemical weapons or Crimea on one day, but ultimately he still has not resolved where his country should be going and what the people of Russia deserve, which is a government that actually responds to their needs.
So I want to thank Madeleine Albright, Condi Rice, Bob Gates. Thank you very much.